Love is never really, I think, doled out in accordance to sort of agreement or affinity. Where love takes root is always in like lack, pain, difficulty, suffering, these sorts of things.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. It's been a hot time in the Old Town this week. In this episode, Mike Cosper, Russell Moore, and I recap the Democratic National Convention in Chicago with David Zoll and survey the responses from outside the party to the rise of Kamala Harris. Then Caitlin Beatty joins us to talk about prairie vibes and trad wives. It's a great show. Welcome. With just 11 weeks to go before Election Day, the Democrats gathered this week in Chicago to both officially nominate Kamala Harris as their candidate and boost the momentum she and running mate Tim Walz will need to get over the finish line in November. Joining us for a recap of the Democratic National Convention and a deeper dive into responses to it is our friend David Zoll of Mockingbird Ministries. David, welcome back to the Bulletin.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, David, we're recording this on Thursday, and so far, nobody has ripped open their shirt on stage. No bulldogs have joined speakers at the podium, and no porn stars have given speeches. In some respects, it feels like a rather benign show thus far. What has stood out to you as you watched the last 3 days of content?
What stands out to me is what I'm hearing everywhere is that the emotional tenor of it, there's been such a hard pivot in the Democratic Party towards this joy narrative. And I didn't see it coming. It's very different from the tenor that I guess we had when Biden was the nominee, but also the personal element. We've heard talks now about loss and infertility. I don't associate those with political conventions. So those are just a few things. I knew that the music would be good. It always is at the DNC. I just didn't expect people to look like they were having so much fun, given the grim state of the narratives before the nomination shifted.
Russell, could you have anticipated this level of joy?
I think it was a very, very carefully planned and crafted convention. I think there were parts of it that were organic, just the way people are responding to excitement in the room. I mean, I think very few people knew that Lil Jon was going to come out during the Georgia roll call. And so there are these elements of surprise that they're putting into it because they recognize now a convention isn't what it used to be, of a sort of we're doing business and we're talking to the American people as we do it. It is a way of speaking to persuadable voters and showing a different vision. So I think you had some of it that was organic. And then I think you had some of it that was very much planned to say this isn't just about don't go back to Donald Trump. We actually do have a way to try to bring people back together. Now, whether that can actually happen or not, the fact that that is a major theme of this, I mean, you think of Tim Walz saying we want to be able to have Thanksgiving again with our relatives. Think about the language that was very carefully used. Bill Clinton did it, many other people did it about, look, our neighbors who disagree with us, respect them, treat them as human beings. We're neighbors. Oprah did that in hers about a house on fire and helping each other as neighbors. I think that's very, very carefully planned to say this is the direction that we think people want to go because they're so exhausted by the last 10 years of screaming at each other.
Mike, night one of the convention had this long farewell to President Biden, so long, in fact, that it pushed his speech out of primetime hours and late into the evening. On day two, we watched Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer awkwardly getting jiggy with it as he approached the podium. And on day three, we have former President Bill Clinton, who is saying, I'm still younger than Donald Trump. Talk to me a little bit about age and youthfulness. This felt like perhaps the first Gen X convention that we've seen. Are the Democrats not so subtly trying to put the old folks out to pasture?
I mean, I think so. I mean, there's been a lot of interesting palace intrigue around Biden's exit from the ticket and how that all came together, and particularly in terms of the drama between him and the Obamas, and him and Nancy Pelosi as well. Clearly they have sought to make this kind of a virtual Viking funeral for Biden, and to send him out with a bang and to honor him as much as they can in these moments. But there is also a very unsubtle message that keeps coming through. For instance, in Michelle Obama's speech, which, by the way, the Republicans should be very glad that Michelle Obama has not yet entered politics. I think she demonstrated once again she's maybe the most popular convention speaker in America right now. And she delivered, I think, the highlight speech of the convention thus far, if you were inclined to be sort of ideologically with her. But she openly says in the speech, I almost didn't come. I was tempted not to be here. And it's hard to not think about the transition from Biden to Harris when she talks that way. I also think there's this interesting contrast of their attitude in 2016 and their attitude in 2020 was to approach the elections with a sense of urgency, even a sense of trepidation and fear. And if you think where we were in 2020, we were in the midst of the pandemic, the George Floyd riots were going on, America was in a pretty dark place. Trump's rhetoric has always been, this is a terrible country run by idiots. What a nightmare. Even when he's in office, he kind of presents things that way. In 2020, that was Biden's rhetoric. Not exactly the same, but his rhetoric was very much about the problems of the Trump administration, the chaos that had unfolded as a result. And even in this cycle, Biden's rhetoric has been very much about the threat to democracy and we have to stop Donald Trump and all of this. So I think there's something fascinating about the pivot that the Democrats have made to this joy message, embracing youthfulness, embracing a sort of younger energy, even while they platformed the same old politicians for much of the convention. I think people are responding to that for sure. They're responding to somebody who's showing up going, hey, we love America. Let's wrap ourselves in the American flag. Go Team USA. Didn't you love the Olympics? High school football's great too. Let's choose something better. And I think people are responding to that significantly.
You talk about Michelle Obama saying, I almost didn't come. And I think about the folks in that roll call who didn't come. Now, Russell, it's normal for delegates to abstain or to not be present to cast a vote. But what do you think the particular message is that these delegates are sending this year? What are they trying to tell their party and the public when they say, nope, we're not in for Kamala?
The surprising thing there is how few present votes there actually were. And as a matter of fact, one of the things you didn't see is usually in a roll call, there are favorite son sorts of nominations. And so 2 votes were Bernie Sanders or something along those lines. And we didn't see that at all. And so it's very difficult to know why someone in a particular state delegation will say, I'm voting present. Sometimes that has to do with, I wanted a better seat at the convention, and so I'm letting the chair of our state party know that. Sometimes it's, I disagree with the nominee on Gaza or whatever, and I'm making a protest. But there was very, very little of it, and very little sort of consternation within the hall. And that's what many were expecting. Not 1968 with police fighting with protesters in the streets, but expecting more division within the hall. One of the most striking moments last night is when the parents of the American hostage captured by Hamas came to the microphone, and the entire place gave them a standing ovation with chants of USA. I had a Republican congressman text me and say, wow, I was not expecting to see that. So I think the story actually was how little of that there was. Some of that, I think, has to do with the fact that there was such a dark cloud over the entire party, with Biden leading the ticket and people thinking we're going to lose, we're not going to have energy, and then that changing. There's kind of almost a catharsis of the pages turned here.
Russell mentioned this family of the hostage. David, you mentioned the folks who came and told their stories about infertility. In the midst of all of these celebrity speeches, we have these sort of everyday American voices. How do you think these stories shape our understanding of the larger issues that actually haven't been talked about a lot from the podium this week?
I think that the Democrats understand well that their opportunity here was to do a massive vibe check to really set an emotional tone and to change the feeling in the room, that it's an emotional event, not really one in terms of policy making. I think we'll walk away from this being like, those were some incredible speeches. I still have no idea what the actual platform is, or I have very little sense of how Kamala differs from Biden or whatnot. I mean, it's still unfolding, so we don't quite know. But I think that they've been very shrewd and inspired in the way that they've done it.
One of the characters who projected this everyman kind of exterior was First Gentleman Doug Emhoff. And Mike, I'm wondering how the party is trying to reshape the narrative around the Israel Hamas war by bringing the family of the hostage or Doug Emhoff to the stage.
I think very clearly they are. And I think what Democrats would say is, what are you talking about? We've been supportive of Israel. We've sold them arms. We have supported them. We've sent troops into the region. I think people in the Biden administration would largely say we have been full throatedly in support of Israel. We just want to see the war fought in a way that is just and humane. And we want a ceasefire and a hostage negotiation release. And we want to bring peace to the region. Those who've been critical of that would say that they've been too slow on some of that support. And I think it's very interesting the way that they have framed this. There's a constituency of voters in Michigan who withheld their support for Biden during the primary season, and they have been lobbying to get a speaker on stage to speak, either a Palestinian speaker or a pro-Palestine speaker of some sort on the stage. And so far, the DNC has continually told them no. As of the last reporting I saw on it, they're not going to have a pro-Palestine voice on the platform this week, which I think is significant, given some of the stuff that's happened inside the DNC. I'd also point to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's speech early on this week, which was surprisingly mainstream liberal and not super reflective of her record as a member of the squad and one of the most progressive members of the House. She called for a ceasefire during her speech, but she also called for the release of all the hostages. That's a tone shift, and that sounds like a small thing, but there's a difference between saying, we want a ceasefire, and saying, we want a ceasefire and the hostages have to come home. And I think people who are very pro-Israel, I think a lot of Jewish voters as well, hear that difference, and it does matter to them. She was also photographed with the hostage family holding up a picture that in Hebrew said, bring them home. So I think that is a signal of some sort.
Is there anything for conservatives here? Is there any bridge building that you see that the convention has done to reach out to those who feel disenfranchised when it comes to the Republican Party?
Well, we have more Republicans speaking at this convention, exponentially more than I can remember at any convention. I mean, John Kasich spoke in 2020, but this year, Jeff Duncan, former Republican lieutenant governor of Georgia, Olivia Troy, Trump's press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, our friend Adam Kinzinger. So there definitely was an appeal being made to Republicans. And you can tell, usually with these conventions, there's a lot of coaching that goes on behind the scenes of saying these are the things that you can say and these are the things you can't say. You'll notice there was a lot of talk about extreme MAGA Republicans. And a lot of the Republicans who spoke made it very clear to say, if you're voting for her, you're not necessarily becoming a Democrat. You're simply saying these things and doing these things. So I think that was an intentional sort of appeal being made. Whether or not it's successful, we won't know really for several weeks to come. But definitely that was part of the intention.
David, do you see enough at this convention to fuel the party for the next 70 something days? They seem still skittish about their popularity.
I mean, who wants to be anti-joy? I mean, I don't anti-hope and anti-joy. I mean, I'm a Christian. I'm at least in theory for both of those things. So I think that that's again a very, very smart pivot. I wonder, as Russell said, there's a organic sense of relief that also translates into a joy that people, I mean, Michelle kind of put it into words like, can you feel the hope returning? and that there is something organic. Joy is a touchy thing, though, because it doesn't ever respond to willpower. So if you're constantly being told to be more joyful, I remember after an Easter service at a former church where I served, the head pastor was very upset that there wasn't more joy. And he came into the meeting and said, "We've got to have more joy." And so I thought, if it turns into that, we're in trouble. Right now, it's a good thing.
Here's why the joy theme is important, because what's happening at these conventions is not a driver of what public opinion is. It's a bet being placed on what you think American public opinion is. So if you think about the most famous Democratic convention in Chicago in 1968, Hubert Humphrey, the nominee that year, was running on the politics of joy. In the primary season, Robert F. Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy both said, "How can you talk about the politics of joy when we're in the middle of Vietnam, when we've had Martin Luther King assassinated, when the protesters and police are fighting in the streets? How is this the politics of joy?" What they were saying was it doesn't fit with the mood of the country. What Reagan tried to do in 1984 was to place a bet, "Morning in America." People actually are ready to feel good about America right now. Barack Obama bet on hope and change. People really do want to have a sense of hope. And so I'm reading that in the people, and I want to emphasize and echo it back to them. The bet that's being made now is that after 8 years of American carnage, followed by COVID and everything that we went through, there's a sense of wanting to be joyful and to have fun again. So that's a bet that they're making, and we'll see in November whether that's what people want. But right now, at least from the top of the ticket on the Republican side, the bet is the other way. I mean, even just the way that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have been responding to the convention is with a sense of everything's awful and we need to be angry about that. This convention is betting that people are tired of that.
And I think the pick of Tim Walz in particular was also a bet on a return to kind of that Reagan meat and potatoes, ain't America great kind of thing. Whether or not Walz translates outside of the Democratic bubble to actually communicate that to white working class voters, I think that's to be seen. I think he's got some real obstacles in terms of his policy record and things like that. But that's certainly the bet. And that's why you keep hearing him talk about football and calling him coach. And it's why Steve Kerr spoke as well. And my hunch is that's going to be more effective than I think some of the Republican critics are giving him credit for. Because I think the fundamental bet that Russell was just talking about, that people want to feel good about their country, is usually the right bet to make.
You know, a political consultant said to me the other day, really what people are trying to decide right now is whether when people sit down and they want to stream reruns, if they want to stream Breaking Bad or Ted Lasso. And those bets are being placed in different directions.
Well, thank you for this recap. We're going to dig a little bit deeper after this break. We will be right back. While the Democrats have tried to project a joyful gathering this week, not everybody has been thrilled with the rhetoric and pageantry within the United Center. Protesters have caused commotion outside the building, and Republicans are busy developing strategies to take down the Harris-Walz ticket as it rides on newbie enthusiasm. Mike, some have previously compared the potential for protest that the DNC in 1968 had at the height of the Vietnam War, but reports seem to indicate it's been quieter than that over the last few days. Talk to me a little bit about these protests and why they haven't provided as much bluster as we might have expected.
I think they had a low turnout. The folks that were organizing the protests, if you heard the press leading up to the convention, they were expecting quite a lot. I spoke to somebody who was involved in Chicago politics early on this summer. They were dreading it. They were saying the Chicago police are preparing for 100,000 people in the streets. And it just hasn't turned out to be that much. There's been a few sort of surge moments of louder protests, more obnoxious protests, that sort of thing. But it's not a bang, it's a whimper. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is I think enthusiasm around the protests has waned a little bit because it feels like the war's almost over. We've kind of lived perpetually on the brink of a ceasefire agreement for a couple of months here, and it keeps getting canceled or postponed or delayed for various reasons. That said, we still have one more day. Tonight's the night Harris is supposed to speak. This would be the night that you would see the most energy and activity from them trying to get attention when most people are going to be looking at it. So by the time this airs, we might see something different. I happen to think we won't, because I just think some of the momentum around this has changed. I also think that you've heard more in the last few weeks about the hostages than you've heard in a long time. Various stories in the media, interviews, hostages who've returned home have been doing more press, trying to kind of get attention to the ceasefire deal. And I think that dampens the sentiment. You're not as likely to go out on the streets and shout from the river to the sea when you've got the hostages on your mind. And I think that's a good thing. I think they should be foremost on our mind. There's still, I believe, 8 Americans somewhere over there. And this is something we should all be thinking about and praying for.
Former President Trump walked out on stage at the RNC to It's a Man's World. And David younger men, 18 to 29, have fled to the Republican Party over the last decade. Did you see enough at the DNC to draw them back? And do you think that American men are ready for a female president?
I did see quite a bit. I mean, the football coach speech was quite effective. I'm not a football player myself, but I do love Friday Night Lights and like everyone, and I recognize that he was speaking the language of the heart for a lot of guys out there. Whether or not that'll be enough to keep them listening or not listen to other things, I don't know. I did see again the selection of Tim Walz and him playing up that part of his persona felt like a olive branch there. I think that most American men would elect a woman. I don't know if they would elect Kamala Harris, but if I think of the narrative is I hate women if I don't vote for her, if that becomes the narrative, that's going to be trouble because no one wants to feel accused like that. However, that's in her hands, really, not the party.
Well, the data are not showing right now that there is the kind of gender gap that there seems to be online. If you actually look at the data, when you look at under 35 people, there's not that big of a gap between young men and young women here. So a lot of that can be easily distorted by what we see in terms of the loudest and most extreme voices out there. I also think that there has been an intentional downplaying of the historic first woman president sorts of language. I think that's intentional here. You don't have everyone dressed in white suffragette sort of outfits like you did in 2016 with the Hillary Clinton campaign. Not any reference that I can see at all to the fact that Inauguration Day, January 20th of 2025, is also Martin Luther King Day. So I think that has been de-emphasized. And as one person pointed out, I think a lot of this has to do with, again, it comes down to a bet on what vision of masculinity young men are ready to embrace. Is it Hulk Hogan, or is it Tim Walz's son standing up, tears in his eyes, and saying, "That's my dad"? I heard from a dad this morning who was not inclined to resonate with anything at the Democratic convention, who said, "I was weeping because I know what it's like to have a son who's been struggling, and to see that son stand up and just say, 'That's my dad,' was just a very human kind of moment." It also is a very fatherly sort of moment. So the question is whether that works and whether that's actually what young men are looking for.
Are we going to have this conversation without talking about the big Trump interview this week with Theo Vaughn,
Oh,
the
yeah,
online influencer?
yeah,
They were, of course, talking about the things that matter to the American people in an election season, cocaine. And
yeah.
Vaughn was talking about how much he liked cocaine. He said, "I'll have a drink these days when I got a hankering for cocaine." The former president says, "Is cocaine a stronger up?" Vaughn says, "Yeah, I mean, so you're way up with cocaine, more than anything else you can think of." It's a fascinating cultural moment because someone inside that campaign is saying, here's who you need to talk to lock down young men. This is who young men are paying attention to.
There's no one more full of despair than that cohort of young men. I mean, the deaths of despair are off the charts. And especially if you're anyone engaged in ministry, you know that that's a really, really troubled and difficult group to break into as well. But the bet on joy, therefore, I cannot think will be a bad thing because there's so much despair. Whether or not the joy thing, again, whether or not it rings hollow going forward, I don't know. But I know that if you're taking the spiritual temperature of that group, the spiritual temperature is incredibly dark and sad. And so I'll be interested to see how it plays out.
And I think there's a parallel. Take the politics and put them away for a minute and just look at the mission of the church. There is this in political life, you're going to go wrong if you seem like you don't know what's going on with people. And so everything's great. It's morning in America. If people can't afford their groceries, they're going to reject that. You also tend to go wrong if you're coming in and doing American carnage when they're wanting to get back to a sense of joy. The message of the church has both a recognition of the real human condition, the real fallen human condition. Things are as bad as you think they are, but they're a lot worse. And this aspirational sense of joy of what it means to be joined to Christ and to be in the Spirit. And you actually can have joy even in the midst of darkness. And so I think there are a lot of churches that kind of get on either end of that in a fake, inauthentic sort of way. So it's either we've got joy coming, we're going to sing all of just really happy songs, or it's everything is miserable and scary and we have to huddle in and protect ourselves, rather than that biblical message that says, no, there's part of you that is attuned to lament and to groan. And there's a part of you that is wired to rejoice in Christ. I think we have to hit both of those, and that can be really difficult sometimes.
Russell, you wrote back in February about political homelessness, and it seems like this is a moment where we're longing to find our place. You said, often though, God uses external circumstances like the shaking of a civic order that once seemed stable to free us from idols we would not have relinquished on our own.
What I mean by political homelessness is not a lack of belonging to a party or lack of activity in a party. I think that there ought to be a certain kind of homelessness for Democrats, for Republicans, for independents, for members of minor parties, in the sense that we recognize Hebrews chapter 11. That we could have a home and turn back and go to it, but we're looking for another home. And so we are wayfarers, we are strangers and exiles, which means that a Christian might be, as with any other natural loyalty or natural affiliation, say, I'm a member of my political party. I mostly agree with what my political party has to say, but it's not ultimate. And I'm not shaping and forming the way I think things around those kinds of tribal affiliations. And that can bring not only a sense of freedom, but it can prevent the kind of cynicism and disengagement that always happens with this sense of we're either going to win everything or we're going to lose everything. James Davison Hunter talks about this as millennialism, which of course is coming from a biblical concept, Revelation 20, however you interpret it, of this 1,000-year reign that is meant to be defined in terms of Christ. He says there's a way in which people think in these very exuberant kinds of terms, and then what happens? Then they're ultimately completely angry and fearful, because if you have a counterfactual in your mind, if my party had won, then everything would be great, and now they're not. Or your party does win and you realize, oh, everything is not the way I thought it would be. A certain kind of homelessness ought to say to you, these things are important with my country, but my life is not completely bound up in any of those things and in any of these parties. And so you're willing then to, at times, deviate from your party and to have a conscience that's free from the party platform. I think that's important for all of us.
Coach Waltz said that we want to have Thanksgiving dinners again. And David, when you think about this idea of political homelessness, what do you think that Thanksgiving dinner would look like relationally for someone who says, I'm committed to being politically homeless?
anyone who's been married, one of the early rites of passage in marriage is when you go to those Thanksgiving and you watch. I'm with my new wife and she hears something that my mother has said, for example. I know what my mother meant by it, and I also know how my wife's going to take it. Same with what my dad says. And that is basically like being politically homeless. And it's excruciating, it's discomforting, but it also kind of increases love and tolerance for people, knowing that, oh my goodness, I know how that's going to be taken. And oh my goodness, I know how that's going to be heard. That does put us in a place, I think, of loving both those people. But anyone who's, again, who's sat at that table knows that it's uncomfortable. And so I think this is the experience of being a Christian, by the way. I mean, I think it's always been that way. And when it hasn't been that way, we're sort of kidding ourselves because, as Russell said, we're exiles, we're pilgrims. If you are too at home in one of these parties, I wonder if the tail's wagging the dog when it comes to one's faith. So it's going to be uncomfortable, but I think it will also be worthwhile and it will be much more real because love is never really, I think, doled out in accordance to sort of agreement or affinity. Where love takes root is always in like lack, pain, difficulty, suffering, these sorts of things. And if you can clear the decks to have some of those conversations and to continue to stay in touch with people who you know you don't work going to vote the same way as, you might also get to be there when they're struggling with fertility, when they are dealing with the loss of their parent. And at that point, a Christian has something to say that has a lot more potency than anything you'll hear at the RNC or the DNC, which, again, as exciting and great as these things are, there's going to be another one in 4 years. And there was one 4 years before this. And the temptation to put our hope and our faith in those sorts of things, it's ever present. It's present in me. But I also know that to do the hard work of being a Christian in the world, of loving other people and imitating Jesus, is really to kind of stay at the table and just sort of absorb a little bit of the mismatch in communication and kind of just continue to be there.
A friend of mine explained this better than I think I've ever heard, talking about his mother in law. And he said it's a little bit of a struggle when she comes over because she takes every perceived slight and in her mind imagines what the ultimate endpoint of that slight might end up to be and emotionally calibrates to that. And so it immediately becomes that. And so we have to just make sure that we're not going to set any of that off. And I thought, that's really kind of what almost every kind of social situation and family situation and even sometimes church situations have ended up being, where even these sorts of political differences aren't really about what our positions are on different things. They're not even really about the vibes of whether we prefer a joyful sort of Kamala Harris convention or a darker kind of Donald Trump convention. It has to do with, are you out to destroy me? And are you talking about the very core and the very root of who I am? The question is, we've tried that for a long time. Are we tired of it? And if we are tired of it, is there something else? For those of us who are Christians, in all of these really small ways, to try to find those ways to show there actually can be a different way of living. We actually can do this.
There's an incredible passage in that book, Demon Copperhead, from Barbara Kingsolver, where the title character writes, I wanted to go home, which was nowhere, but it's a feeling you keep having even after there's no longer a place anymore. Probably if they dropped a bomb and there wasn't any food left on the planet, you'd still keep feeling hungry too. And that to me is our home is elsewhere. And knowing that that's for sure it's not going to be here, there, or, it's not going to be in Iowa, it's also not going to be in Portland, Oregon. It allows you to engage with what actually is in front of you with its both positives and negatives. I think that that's an invitation or an opportunity to love rather than one to judge.
Thank you so much for that, David. And thank you, gentlemen, for this conversation. Conventions always feel a little bit like a meal at the Cheesecake Factory. It's going to take us a few days to digest it all. So, listeners, we always appreciate your feedback. Rate and review us in your podcast app and tell your friends about the show. We will be right back. Last month, journalist Megan Agnew traveled to rural Utah to investigate modern motherhood. She was headed to the ranch of social media famous trad wife Hannah Neeleman and her husband Daniel, a businessman and heir to the JetBlue fortune. Since that visit, Agnew's article from the Times of London featuring the couple has sparked a fascinating conversation about marriage and motherhood. Joining us to talk about identity, femininity, and cottagecore is author and podcaster Caitlin Beatty. Caitlin, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Caitlin, what are trad wives specifically? What is cottagecore? Why should the average person care about this trend?
Trad wives are women who create online content that celebrates a pre-modern understanding of femininity. So, inherent in this image is the sense that culture has gone off the rails, especially when it comes to gender roles, how women understand their own calling, what they're created by God to do. And so trad wives are often creating social media content, very kind of beautiful, traditionally feminine images of themselves, cooking something, baking something. Oftentimes, trad wives have lots of children. So they talk a lot about the glories of motherhood, their relationship to their husbands. It's kind of a celebration of traditional femininity. And I think it's important to understand this is an online phenomenon. This is something that is being created for internet consumption. And so because of that, it can't help getting caught up in some of the really intense culture war conversations that are happening online. Oftentimes, trad wife content is shared almost to say, this is how women should be. The feminists today have gone off the rails. Women should be more like this. It is performative.
20 years ago, when I became a mom, it was all the rage to cloth diaper your babies and to make your own baby food. And I did that because it was cool, but also because it was cheap. I was juggling staying at home with my kids, with working, because frankly, my husband and I just couldn't afford to do anything other. And then social media emerged, and what I was doing was suddenly hashtag girl boss, as though culture was telling me that spreading myself this thin was actually supposed to be somehow enervating to me. And Mike, I wonder if the trad wife trend, do you think it's a backlash to that kind of exhaustion? Like, even if it's actually not simpler, do we really just long for a life that's not as complex as the one that we see in our day planners?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. There's something to the romance of this kitchen without any devices in it, and going out every morning and getting fresh eggs from your hens and grinding your own wheat and all this kind of stuff. The key point that Caitlin has already made is that it is performative. One of the funniest examples of this is one of the more influential trad wives, the one you mentioned a moment ago, just got roasted one day on Twitter because she posted this photo of herself in the kitchen, and she was talking about the simplicity of this way of life and how much simpler things were and how much better, and she doesn't miss the big city and all her gadgets and all the rest or whatever. And she was standing in front of like a $30,000 stove. This is still conspicuous consumption. It's still performative in the way that much of social media is. It's not that different than a guy posting pictures of himself in front of his freshly waxed Tesla or BMW or whatever the cool kids are driving these days. I drive a Honda. So there's a lot to it that is the social media phenomenon. Would this woman be sewing her own clothes, grinding her own wheat, raising her own chickens if she didn't have an audience to perform for, to sort of validate all of those choices?
I want to press into that a little bit, Caitlin, because knowing that roughly half of all children in the US will see their parents' marriages end in divorce, I wonder, yes, it's performative, but is there something undergirding this? Are we longing for a life that we've never actually had?
Absolutely. I mean, the trad wife phenomenon would not be a phenomenon if it wasn't speaking to some kind of deep longings that a lot of people in the modern world have and feel something has gone wrong. Whether we're looking at family breakdown, deep economic stress and precarity, a loss of tradition. I think we have to account for the faith elements of a lot of tradwife content, the sense that there was a time when families would go to church together every Sunday and pray before meals and read their Bibles together. We should embrace that vision of life. Something important and even transcendent has been lost. And here are these alternative images or visions of what life could be like. Whether or not we are drawn to the specific tradwife vision of what the good life is, I think we have to acknowledge and contend with these desires and longings for returning to something better and richer.
And there is something innately good about domesticity, having a home that's hospitable, feeding your family, feeding your kids, like all of that stuff that I think these influencers are tapping into. Those are good things. What's unfortunate is because it becomes attached to culture war stuff, it gets moralized, and it gets moralized in ways that's really harmful to the audience. Here's a standard to which you can never reach. And if you're a mom with a chronic illness and 3 little kids, guess what? You probably need to do store-bought baby food. You might need to do formula. You might need to do diapers. And Jesus loves you. And no one should judge you for those decisions.
I wrote this week that there's a TikTok tradwife video that actually sums up and explains for me so much of what's going on in American culture right now. And it's actually not the video, it's comedian Josh Johnson's reflection on what happened with a tradwife who used a racial slur, provoked a controversy, which meant her content went more viral than it would have. So she doubled down on the racial slurs and started to find a home among the white nationalists and white supremacists, who then double canceled her by digging up her old not racist tweets in order to say, but you don't mean it though. And the stand-up routine was hilarious and insightful, and also sort of exposed not just the performative nature of all of this, but this longing for a kind of community. Let me find my online group. And those are the kind of people that we are. And so I become the kind of person I am, not just by the kind of people I watch, but by the people who hate them and the people who are trying to cancel them. That just sums up so much of what's going on right now.
Yeah, I think it's important to contend with something that Russell just touched on, which is there's a reason why the vast majority of tradwife content is from white women, and there's a kind of dark underbelly to some of this content. This longing to return to pre-modern America is also a longing to return to an America where we didn't have racial equality as kind of a foundation of our society, where we could kind of claim America as a primarily white Christian country. There's also the dark underbelly. I know there's been so much reporting on the actual lives of some of these women. And this is certainly not true for all of them, but there are stories of some of the tradwife content creators living in abusive marriages, like where they are actually suffering, away from the camera. They are not in good situations. And I'm not saying that is true for all of them, or that traditional culture necessarily leads to abuse in the home. But I am saying we have to wrestle with the kind of real life implications for some of these women, or for people who are claiming this content and upholding it as this is how women should be, or this is how America should be. There are some unchristian impulses that are leading to the virality of this content.
It's really interesting to me too that we have the tradwife content, but the stereotypically male content that we have in this way is not here's how to be a better husband and father and provide for your family. It's more likely to be Andrew Tate, arrested this week for trafficking young women, saying this is how I dominate women through sexual conquest and through a quarrelsomeness and fighting sort of spirit that scripture warns us against. It's just really interesting the two directions that this sort of content can go that would seem to be contradictory in some ways, but maybe aren't.
Trends like this certainly remind us that the world is not our home and that the church is intended to be our family. So if you're looking for satisfying and profitable labor, put your hand to the plow in those places. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for joining us. Listeners, thanks for being with us. We will see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester, theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.